The Ukrainian president just tore Europe apart today.
Glory to Ukraine.
Volodymyr Zelensky addressed Europeans in Davos, telling them they are weak, confused, and dependent on the United States. But what if Russia attacks Europe and America doesn't help? What will you do? Zelensky directly stated that old Europe looks confused and frightened, but it could look like a global power. Zelensky directly stated that Europeans are even afraid to speak out loud about Taurus missiles which would fly towards Moscow. Or, for example, Zelensky wonders why the United States seizes tankers from Russia's shadow fleet while Europe is afraid. Why did Donald Trump seize Nicolas Maduro, but Europe is afraid to seize Vladimir Putin, or at least strike him in such a way that he can't recover? Overall, Volodymyr Zelensky's speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos was critical and revealing. And importantly, Volodymyr Zelensky's speech and Donald Trump's threats seemed to work in sync. Because today, Emmanuel Macron announced that France had seized a tanker from the Russian Federation's shadow fleet and had begun legal proceedings against it. Let's break down in this episode all of Volodymyr Zelensky's speeches in Davos and how he criticized Europe for its weakness, and try to answer the question, did Zelensky go too far with his criticism or was it all deserved? And won't the Europeans be offended? My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave any comment under this episode, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in.
Trying to convince the United States president to change, but he will not change. President Trump loves who he is, and he says he loves Europe. To be continued.
This episode features many quotes from Volodymyr Zelensky. Let's review them step by step. During his speech, Zelensky directly stated that Europe is a bunch of confused weaklings who need to finally pull themselves together and stop relying on the Americans. Zelensky emphasized that last year in Davos he said that Europe should know how to defend itself, but a year has passed and he is forced to talk about it again because nothing has changed in this regard. Zelensky said that Europeans on the one hand are simply frozen and, are waiting for Donald Trump to stop yelling at them about Greenland and tariffs. They just hope the United States will defend Europe if Putin attacks. But Zelensky is directly asking today in Davos, what if Trump doesn't change his mind and the United States doesn't help Europe with its defense? So what will Europe do then? And Zelensky also directly stated, stop waiting for Donald Trump to change. He won't. He likes himself as he is, and you need to understand that's who he is. I should note right away that Volodymyr Zelensky's speech was tough toward European leaders, especially after Donald Trump's equally tough speech. But there is one fundamental difference. Donald Trump's speech today in Europe was perceived as criticism from someone who is trying to punish Europe. But Volodymyr Zelensky's speech is perceived differently, even by European society, not just by European leaders. The fact is that for European politicians, Zelensky's speech today is even beneficial. And I'm sure that behind the scenes, European leaders even thanked Zelensky for exactly such a critical speech. Because now, relying on the words of the leader of a country at war, they can, for example, increase military spending while cutting, say, social programs. Well, it sounds harsh, but this way it's easier for European leaders to show determination to their allies. Like, look, yes, we have to act this way because it's not just Trump criticizing us, but even the leader of a country at war. No matter what we think of Zelensky, he's well liked in Europe. Look, Zelensky is saying that we're weak, so let's finally pull ourselves together and become strong. And by the way, Emmanuel Macron was the first to catch on to this moment, and you'll understand why in a moment. Now let's review Zelensky's full speech, beginning with a quote. A year ago, I ended my Davos speech by saying Europe must know how to defend itself. A year has passed, nothing has changed. Every year brings something new for Europe and the world. Everyone's attention is focused on Greenland, and it's clear that most leaders simply don't know what to do about it. It seems like everyone is waiting for America to cool down, hoping that everything will pass. But what if it doesn't? What then? There was a lot of talk about the protests in Iran, but they were drowned in blood. The world didn't help the Iranian people enough. It stood aside. In Europe, it was Christmas and New Year. By the time politicians returned to work, the Ayatollah had already killed thousands. If the regime survives, what message does that send? Kill enough people and you'll stay in power. In Venezuela, President Trump led an operation that resulted in Maduro's arrest. There were differing opinions, but the fact is Maduro is under investigation in New York, while Putin is not. This man, in the fourth year of the Great War, is not only not arrested, he is still fighting for his money in Europe and even achieving some success. Putin is the one who decides how the frozen assets will be used, not those who have the authority to punish him for this war. As you can see, the speech is not complimentary. As Zelensky said, fortunately, the European Union decided to freeze Russian assets. But when it came time to use this money to defend against Russian aggression, the decision was blocked. And then Zelensky skillfully stated that because of the United States' position, people are now avoiding the International Tribunal. For America, this is a historic stance. They have always opposed the tribunal for one simple reason, because they have their own sins. And they don't want a precedent so that Americans won't be held accountable at a similar tribunal in the future. But Europe doesn't have such a position. So what's lacking? Time or political will? Why hasn't Europe organized a tribunal for Putin on its own? And why does it always have to wait for the United States? And then there's another interesting quote from Zelensky about the coalition of the willing. I'm grateful for the coalition of the willing, but we need to do everything to turn the coalition of the willing into a coalition of action. Everyone is very positive, but there's always a but. We need President Trump's support. And without the United States, security guarantees don't work. But what does a ceasefire mean, and who will help make it possible? Europe loves to discuss the future, but avoids taking action in the present, actions that actually shape the future. Why can Trump seize shadow fleet tankers, but Europe can't? Russian oil is being transported right along the European coast, and this oil is funding the Russian war. And here we have to give credit to Emmanuel Macron. Macron announced today that France has seized a tanker from the Russian shadow fleet and said that this is just the beginning. The French are ready to seize these tankers. And furthermore, he says, we will no longer tolerate these violations. Why are they in our waters? They seized it in the Mediterranean Sea. He asks why these tankers are in European waters, saying we should seize them all and take them to court. In this case, respect to Macron. I'll continue Zelensky's quote. I'll repeat, Europe needs united armed forces that can truly defend Europe. Today, Europe relies only on the belief that if danger comes, NATO will act. If Putin decides to take Lithuania or strike Poland, who will respond? Today, NATO is based on the belief that the United States will not stand aside. But what if that's not the case? These are the questions in the minds of European leaders. Some are trying to get closer to President Trump. Some hope the problem will go away. Some have started investing in the defense industry, but for some reason, until America started putting on pressure, no one was increasing their spending. What will 40 European soldiers do in Greenland? What signal did that send to Putin and China? And what signal will it send to Denmark, your close ally? If Russian ships are freely sailing around Greenland, Ukraine can help. We have the expertise and weapons to make sure of that. They could sink near Greenland just like they sank near Crimea. That's a great line from Zelensky where he says, listen, of course, this is just ridiculous. All of Europe managed to gather as many as 40 soldiers and sent them to Greenland to show that they are ready to defend it. That's the whole point Zelensky is making. Listen, you're accepting Ukraine into Europe, but if you don't want to do it, we can do it ourselves. We can easily sink those Russian ships. Why are they still sailing in the Black Sea? We've sunk several already with no consequences. And then Vladimir Zelensky once again pointed out that the Europeans are not independent and are confused. Quote, everyone is waiting to see what America will do in Iran, and the world offers nothing, Europe offers nothing, and doesn't want to get involved to support these people and the democracy they need. If nothing is done, the consequences always come back, and they're always negative. In 2020, no one helped the Belarusian people. Now Russian Oreshnik is stationed there. This missile can reach most European capitals. We told our European partners to act now against these missiles. In Belarus, missiles are never just for show. But Europe still remains in Greenland mode. If Europe is not seen as a global power, if its actions do not scare bad actors, it will always only be reactive. And then I really like the remark about the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Just listen to how subtly Zelensky put this servant in his place. The forces that are trying to destroy Europe are operating even within Europe. Every victor who lives off European money while at the same time selling out Europe's interests deserves a slap on the forehead. If he feels comfortable in Moscow, that doesn't mean that European capitals should become little Moscows. And then Zelensky broke down why a regular dialogue with Putin has never worked. What is Russia fighting for? To devalue people so that when dictators want to destroy someone, they can. Everyone can see how Russia is now trying to freeze Ukrainians to death. Minus 20 degrees. Russia wouldn't be able to produce a single missile without critical components from other countries. People often hide behind the excuse that China is helping Russia. Yes, it is helping, but not only China. Russia gets components from Europe, the United States, and Taiwan. Everyone is building a security system around Taiwan. But can Taiwan stop supplying electronics to Russia? Europe says nothing, America says nothing, Putin is making missiles. I am grateful to everyone who supports Ukrainian energy. I am grateful for the Purell program, but it's not cheaper. And wouldn't it be easier to cut Russia off from components or destroy the factories that produce them? Currently, long-range missiles for Ukraine aren't being discussed. And here in Europe, we're advised not to mention tomahawks so as not to spoil the mood and not to even bring up the topic of Taurus missiles. And finally, Volodymyr Zelensky just said what many people were thinking, but no one dared to say. Donald Trump is the way he is, and there's no point in hoping he'll change. We should just build our security without Donald Trump. Instead of becoming a global power, Europe remains a fragmented kaleidoscope of small and medium powers instead of taking the lead in defending freedom. When the United States shifts its focus, Europe looks lost, trying to convince the American president to change, but Trump will not change. He loves himself the way he is. He says he loves Europe, but he will not listen to this kind of Europe. Overall, Zelensky's speech looks really tough, really critical, and in some ways even attacking European leaders. But what's important here is that I think Zelensky caught this wave. Europeans start to act, or rather, European leaders start to act when they are really pressured and when the pressure begins on them. So it looks like the life of an ordinary European, that is, ordinary European society, could get worse because of this, socially, economically, and so on. That is the question of a possible war starting and so on. Well, unfortunately, Europeans aren't really affected by this. Let's be objective. European society isn't really affected by this very much. They believe everything will be fine as it's been for years and expect it to stay that way. But when it's suggested that not spending more on defense could lead to tariffs, causing lower earnings and a reduced standard of living and so on, that's when Europeans start to think about it. So I think Zelensky's speech will benefit European leaders. No one will be offended. Instead, they can point to this speech and say, look, this is how a wartime leader speaks. We should probably act this way. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. And friends, if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation or a paid sponsorship subscription using the links and details in the description of this video, or use the QR code on your screens. I appreciate any support. That's all for now. Take care and goodbye.